Plato tells us that Atlantis was an island in the Atlantic Ocean, which had an empire that controlled, quote, parts of the opposite continent, which in context can only mean the Americas. Plato says that this empire then invaded Europe and North Africa around 9600 to 9500 BC. The Proto-Athenians ultimately repelled this Atlantean invasion, but both sides were subsequently destroyed by cataclysmic earthquakes and flooding. Shockingly, this supposedly mytho-historical allegory actually aligns with much of what we know about the prehistory of this time. Let's do a thought experiment by comparing this so-called mythological history with actual history and see where the two might actually overlap. According to the Solutrean hypothesis, as put forth in the book Across Atlantic Ice by archaeologists Dr. Bruce Bradley and Dr. Dennis Stanford, members of the Paleolithic Solutrean culture of West Europe crossed the North Atlantic Ocean and gave rise to the ancestors of the Clovis culture of North America sometime between 21,000 to 17,000 BC. Among other evidence, they cite the Parsons Island biface, the Sinmar biface, and the Galt site in Texas, all of which date to around 20,000 to 18,000 BC. Their argument is based on cladistic and cluster analysis of tool inventories, as well as tool morphology, flint knapping techniques, the presence of atlatls and other unique tools, and the apparent east-to-west dispersal path of both pre-Clovis and Clovis sites and artifacts. If the Solutrean hypothesis is correct, and if Atlantis was indeed a real island in the Atlantic during the Paleolithic, as Plato claimed, then it's plausible that the Solutreans crossing the Atlantic would have encountered it on their journey, and, if it had a decent enough climate, probably settled there as well. Since the oldest evidence of this transatlantic migration seems to appear on the east coast of North America from around 20,000 to 18,000 BC, I posit this as the most likely terminus antiquem, or date before which Atlantis would have been discovered and probably also settled, if it existed. This means that Atlantis would have been settled sometime during the last glacial maximum, which is when glaciers were at their largest extent and sea levels were at their lowest, between 24,000 to 18,000 BC or so. Interestingly, Diodorus Siculus wrote that both the Greeks and the Atlanteans agreed that the gods were born among the Atlanteans. Diodorus also wrote that some Egyptians believed gods and heroes ruled Egypt from around 23,000 to 5,000 BC, and that Isis and Osiris lived either around 23,000 BC or slightly over 10,000 years before Alexander the Great. Speaking of the Egyptians, a recent paper has been published which redates the Great Pyramid of Giza, using the so-called relative erosion method, to sometime between 37,000 to 9,000 BC, but with the most likely date being around 23,000 BC, which aligns with what Diodorus wrote about the time of the gods and of Isis and Osiris. If we dare to extrapolate and speculate on these disparate passages of Diodorus and the date given by the REM study, perhaps these so-called gods, who supposedly came from Atlantis, are the same ones that supposedly ruled Egypt in 23,000 BC and constructed the pyramid then, if the date given by the REM study is to be believed. However, there is also another, later date that might link the Atlanteans to the Great Pyramid in 10,500 BC, which also falls within the range of dates given by the REM study. Edgar Cayce, a purported psychic medium, spoke of 3 destructions of Atlantis and gave dates for all of them. Cayce notably predicted the discovery of the Bimini Road site in the Caribbean, featured in Graham Hancock's hit Netflix show Ancient Apocalypse, and he associated it with the Atlantean Empire. The first destruction of Atlantis, according to Cayce, came in 17,000 BC, which corresponds to Meltwater Pulse 19 Ka, an episode of accelerated sea level rise also dated to 17,000 BC, which may have caused or been caused by ice sheet collapse, likely due to the ending of the glacial maximum and the subsequent warming. Around 12,700 to 12,600 BC, you have another sea level rise event, Meltwater Pulse 1a, as well as the start of the African humid period and the Bowling interstadial warm period in Europe. If Atlantis existed at this time, it's likely that the rising sea level would have flooded the low-lying parts of the island, possibly forcing some people to relocate, and that simultaneously the improving and increasingly appealing climates of Africa and Europe would attract people towards them. Around this same time, maternal haplogroups H1, H3, H5, and V start spreading out from Iberia, east into the rest of Europe and southeast into North Africa, corresponding chronologically and geographically to the Magdalenian, Arnsberg, and Swiderian cultures in Europe, and the Ibero-Mauritian culture in North Africa. This gene flow dates to sometime between 13,000 to 8,000 BC, and may have come in multiple waves. The start of this gene flow might overlap with the climatic changes just described, but it's unclear how many waves of migration carried these haplogroups and what their exact timing was within that 13,000 to 8,000 BC window, as different dates given by different studies vary by more than 1,000 years. I posit that if Atlantis existed, and there's a kernel of truth to Plato's narrative of it, then at least one of these waves of gene flow likely corresponds to the invasion of Atlantis around 9600 to 9500 BC, since the gene flow overlaps chronologically and geographically with the timing, location, and direction of Plato's claimed Atlantean invasion. Therefore, if Atlantis did exist, as Plato says, I posit that this gene flow could have actually originated from there, with Iberia merely as a stopping point along the way. The reason this expansion is only attested to in mitochondrial DNA may be due to sexual migratory differences, or perhaps because the associated paternal lineages have simply been replaced in the intervening time since then. If we continue to speculate upon Atlantis' existence and the association of this gene flow with it, then it's plausible that the expansion and settlement of Atlanteans into Europe and Africa started or intensified around 13,000 BC due to the aforementioned climate changes, and, as this trend continued, growing tensions between the locals and the newcomers eventually would come to a head and result in the all-out war that Plato describes. For example, the Magdalenian culture associated with this early wave of expansion in Europe is known to have made skull cups, likely as war trophies, and also engaged in exocannibalism, killing members of rival local groups for sustenance, perhaps in something chillingly more akin to hunting people than simply carrying out raids on them. Around this same time, approximately 13,000 BC, paternal haplogroups QM3 of Central America and QL804 of Scandinavia split from a common ancestor, QCTS11969. The distributions of these haplogroups have been argued to support the Solutrean hypothesis, insofar as they appear to indicate a transatlantic migration. Again, presupposing Atlantis was real, it's plausible to speculate that QCTS11969 was present there before it split into the American QM3 and the European QL804. This split could have been due to the rising sea levels of Meltwater Pulse 1a inundating low-lying land bridges between islands, and thereby isolating different groups. Or it could have simply been the result of various migrations that separated these related groups. Edgar Cayce dates the second destruction of Atlantis to sometime around 10,700 to 10,600 BC, but is rather ambiguous about the exact details and timing. This roughly aligns with the start of the Younger Dryas Cold period, which is hypothesized to have been caused by a large astronomical impact or airburst around 10,850 BC, and is also hypothesized to have contributed to the collapse of the widespread homogeneous Clovis culture of North America around 10,750 BC. Edgar Cayce also claimed that Atlantean priests journeyed to Giza in 10,500 BC and constructed a pyramid and sealed records of their history there. The Orion correlation theory, created by Robert Bauval, supports this date, with the archaeoastronomy of the Giza monuments seeming to line up with Orion's belt and the constellation of Leo at 10,500 BC. Geologist Dr. Robert Schoch agrees with this date as well, based on the millennia of rainfall erosion evident in the enclosure of the Sphinx, which must have taken place thousands of years before the end of the African humid period, thus pushing the date of the Sphinx's construction back several millennia as well. This date of 10,500 BC also falls within the range given by the relative erosion method study mentioned earlier, which again dated the Great Pyramid to sometime between 37,000 to 9,000 BC. According to Plato's dialogues, Proto-Athens was founded by the goddess Neith/Athena around 9600 BC. Sometime after, probably in the mid-9500s, the Atlanteans invaded and conquered Europe and North Africa up to Italy and Egypt, respectively. Again, this aligns chronologically and geographically with the direction of the spread of those maternal haplogroups that we mentioned earlier, H1, H3, H5, and V. Haplogroups that were associated with the spread of the violent and cannibalistic Magdalenian culture, and the Ibero-Mauritian culture, the latter of which may be responsible for massacring the Kadan individuals buried at the Jebel Sahaba cemetery in the Nile Valley, which could date to around 9500 BC, potentially the same time as Plato's supposed Atlantean War. Right around this time, the sickles and grinding stones associated with the proto-agrarianism of the Kadan culture in the Nile area suddenly disappear. Then, also around this same time of 9500 BC, right after the war as Plato says, both sides were destroyed in catastrophic floods and earthquakes. One paper examined evidence of two glacial megafloods. The first one dated to around the start of the Younger Dryas, and the second one to around the end of the Younger Dryas, in 9500 BC or so. This latter glacial outburst flood may be responsible for the sea level rise of meltwater pulse 1b, which starts at the same time, around 9500 BC. Moreover, there is evidence of large-scale flooding and/or earthquakes dating to around 10,000 BC on either side of the Atlantic, on the Scotian slope on the one hand, and near the Spartel Bank Paleo Island on the other. Another transatlantic gene flow event may have occurred right after this cataclysm, as maternal haplogroup X2A's distribution and diversity in North America has been argued to support an eastern primary region of dispersal, and therefore a transatlantic origin. If true, X2A likely arrived on the east coast around Newfoundland sometime after 9500 BC and spread to its present location around the Great Lakes by traveling along the St. Lawrence River. Prior to 9500 BC or so, this area would still have been mostly covered by glaciers, and the St. Lawrence River was probably one of the main outlets for floodwater during the 9500 BC glacial outburst flood, thus making this date the most likely terminus post-quem, or date after which X2A carrying people would arrive in the region. North American X2A lacks any close relatives in East Asia and Siberia, and the few X lineages present in Altaians and Siberians are most likely due to recent gene flow from the Near East. This leaves the question of the source of X2A in the Old World unanswered, a fact which, potentially, further supports the possibility of a transatlantic migration. X2A has been detected in the maritime archaic culture, which started as early as 7000 BC around Newfoundland, the now extinct Beothuk tribe of the same region, the Sioux and Navajo, and the Algonquian-speaking Micmac and Ojibwe tribes. Notably, the Ojibwe carry paternal haplogroup R1b at a very high frequency, which has also been argued to be of a transatlantic origin, due to it supposedly being distinct from the European subclades, which would have come from post-colonial admixture. The presence of Native American R1b haplogroups distinct from European ones, though not widely accepted, seems to indicate ancient population founders rather than massive recent male replacement. The Ojibwe also have an oral history that they migrated from the Atlantic coast westward along the St. Lawrence River to their present locations around the Great Lakes, sometime in the last 1,500 years or so, further supporting the notion of an East Coast Atlantic origin for X2A and its subsequent dispersal along the St. Lawrence, as earlier groups likely followed this same path taken by the later Ojibwe. Another set of possible Atlantean refugees went in the opposite direction, as evidenced by the start of the Taz-Tepeller culture in southeastern Anatolia, dated to around 9500 BC. This culture, exemplified by the site of Göbekli Tepe, represents the sudden appearance, almost ex nihilo, of three cultural traits which are also associated with Plato's Atlanteans: writing, megalithic building, and bull sacrifice rituals. Assyriologist Irving Finkeled has argued that this inscription from Göbekli Tepe represents an early form of pictographic writing, and the clay bulle of Mesopotamia to follow, from 9000 BC onward, may be simpler versions of this. Aurochs remains at Göbekli Tepe show evidence of ritual sacrifice, another custom of the Atlanteans. According to Plato, the Atlanteans supposedly possessed writing, with which they would inscribe a pillar with their laws and oaths. Then they would sacrifice a bull over the top of this pillar. One scene carved into a wall at the Taz-Tepeller site of Sayburch might even depict part of this Atlantean bull ritual. A man is shown holding what appears to be a noose or a loop of rope, facing a bovine which is rearing its horns toward him. This seems to depict the first part of the Atlantean bull ritual, wherein the Atlantean kings would capture a sacrificial bull with nooses and staves, but no metal weapon, just as the scene at Sayburch seems to depict a man attempting to subdue a bull with a noose. All of these features, writing, megaliths, and bull sacrifice, appearing suddenly in the Taz-Tepeller culture, right after Atlantis is said to have been destroyed, is probably not a coincidence, in my opinion. Thus, if Atlantis did exist, it's quite plausible to speculate that the Taz-Tepeller culture could have been started by Atlantean refugees, based on its timing and unique cultural parallels. The texts inscribed on the temple walls at Edfu in Egypt indicate that Horus's rule began 7,000 years before the texts were composed, which, according to the translator, Dr. Manu Safzadeh, would have been sometime when authentic Middle Egyptian was still spoken, between 2000 and 1500 BC, thus placing the start of Horus's reign somewhere between 9000 to 8500 BC or so. In these texts, Horus is said to reclaim the round primeval island after the flood recedes. This overlaps with the date given by Plato of around 8600 to 8500 BC for the founding of Proto-Sais by Neith/Athena, and might loosely align with Diodorus's claim that the last of the gods to rule Egypt was Horus, around 5000 BC, especially if we interpret the name Horus as representing a title or dynasty. Dr. Manu Safzadeh believes that the Edfu texts are essentially an Egyptian version of the Atlantis myth, due to the many parallels they contain, such as the round island, the ring sea, and the overlap between the date of Horus's reign with the date given by Plato for the founding of Proto-Sais. He argues that therefore Plato's story of Atlantis really did originate with the Egyptians, and also that Plato is therefore not fabricating a noble lie when he relates the tale, but merely preserving an older inherited story, just as he claimed to be doing. Around 7000 BC, the last wave of gene flow from Iberia into the interior of Europe and Africa occurs, as evidenced by the young branch of U5b1b dated to this time, which is shared by the Sami and Berbers. It appears to have followed the same route as the earlier spread of haplogroups H1, H3, H5, and V, which themselves match up with the Atlantean invasion. If U5b1b is also associated with the Atlanteans, its dispersal would probably represent the last wave of refugees from the very last sinking vestiges of the Atlantean landmass. By 6000 BC or so, all the other paleo landmasses of Sundaland, Doggerland, and Sahuland have all pretty much been entirely submerged. And if Atlantis had existed, its last remnants were probably gone by this time as well. If Atlantis really existed, as we've been speculating throughout this alternative history thought experiment, then this is, in my opinion, the most plausible timeline of events based on all of the data points we've examined. To sum it up, first, Atlantis was settled by the Solutrean ancestors of the Clovis sometime during the last glacial maximum, between 24,000 to 18,000 BC, with the earliest concrete evidence of a transatlantic connection providing the most likely terminus antiquem, dating to at least 18,000 BC if not earlier. The relative erosion method study claims that the Great Pyramid likely also dates to this time period, around 23,000 BC, the same time that Diodorus Siculus wrote that the, quote, gods, who originated from Atlantis, began their rule in Egypt. In 17,000 BC, Atlantis experienced its first cataclysm, per Edgar Cayce, which coincides with meltwater pulse 19 Ka, also at 17,000 BC. Around 13,000 BC, the maternal haplogroups H1, H3, H5, and V start to spread from Atlantis eastward into Iberia, and then from there into Central/Northern Europe and North Africa. Also, at 13,000 BC, the Central American QM3 and the North European QL804 split off from a common ancestor, QCTS11969, which possibly originated on Atlantis. These demographic changes could have been due to rising sea levels caused by meltwater pulse 1a, which might have cut off land bridges connecting certain islands, thereby isolating paternal lineages, as well as flooding out residents of the lowlands, potentially spurring migrations into nearby Europe and Africa. The second major destruction of Atlantis comes around 10,700 to 10,600 BC, according to Cayce, which corresponds to the hypothesized Younger Dryas impact event, an event which has also been associated with the end of the Clovis period in North America. In 10,500 BC, Cayce claims that Atlantean priests journeyed to Giza and created sealed records and a pyramid there, a date which the Orion correlation theory claims is supported by the archaeoastronomy of the Giza monuments, as well as the geology of the Sphinx. According to Plato's account, Neith/Athena founded Proto-Athens around 9600 BC. Then, sometime probably in the mid-9500s, the Atlanteans invaded. If the Jebel Sahaba cemetery does in fact date to this time, then it could possibly represent direct evidence of this conflict. After the Proto-Athenians repelled the invasion, both sides were destroyed by earthquakes and floods around 9500 BC, which corresponds to a glacial flood and meltwater pulse that occurred around the same time. Right after the flood of 9500 BC, Atlantean refugees may have crossed the Mediterranean and started the Taz-Tepler culture in Anatolia, as evidenced by the uncanny cultural parallels between them. Also sometime after the 9500 BC flood, X2A and R1B carrying Atlantean refugees landed near Newfoundland and traveled up the St. Lawrence River into the interior of the continent. Between 9000 to 8500 BC, Horus begins his reign and reclaims the remnants of Atlantis after the flood has receded, according to the Edfu texts. Around 8600 to 8500 BC, Proto-Sais was founded by Neith/Athena, according to Plato. By around 7000 BC, the last wave of Atlantean refugees had entered Europe and Africa, represented by the maternal haplogroup U5b1b, which is shared by the Sami and the Berbers and dates to this time. By 6000 BC, all paleo landmasses, including the last remnants of Atlantis, are essentially gone for good. According to this speculative reconstruction of the Atlantean timeline, their most likely descendants would be the Basque, the Sami, and the Berbers, based on the distribution of maternal haplogroups H1, H3, H5, V, and U5b1b. but also the Ojibwe, Micmac, Beothuk, Sioux, and Navajo, based on maternal haplogroup X2A. And finally, Atlanteans would have heavily contributed to the ancestry of Central Americans, and very minorly to that of Nordics, based on the distributions of paternal haplogroups QM3 and QL804, respectively. While I show my citations for this video on the screen now, let me also take the time to credit Mary Sedegast, who wrote the book Plato Prehistorian, to which I consider this project as something of a spiritual successor. Her book, along with Across Atlantic Ice by Dr. Bradley and Dr. Stanford, The Timaeus and the Critias by Plato, the Edfu Temple Building Text translation by Dr. Safzadeh, the book Origins of the Sphinx by Robert Bavall and Dr. Schock, the mediumistic readings of Edgar Cayce, and the work of Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson, together all form the basis of knowledge and research from which this timeline was extrapolated and pieced together. And I would recommend for anyone interested in the topic of Atlantis to look into them as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe if you enjoyed. And if you found this topic to be intriguing, you may also enjoy my Atlantis video series, where I explore all of this data and much more in much more detail, including a video on the genetic and archaeological evidence of the possible Atlantean role in an early independent horse domestication event in Iberia.